Dr. Daniel Dennett, who is a cognitive scientist, has said human consciousness is the same. It's the brain's user illusion of itself. It feels real and important to us, but it just isn't a very big deal. The brain doesn't have to understand how the brain works. So if a cognitive scientist is saying that consciousness is an illusion, we have to ask, how does he know he was conscious when he made that statement? And how do we know his brain isn't getting the rest of us to live an illusion ourselves? In fact, Frank Turek writes, his claim is not only superstitious, it's logically indefensible. In order to detect an illusion, you'd have to be able to see what's real. Just like you need to wake up to know that a dream is only a dream. Daniel Dennett would need to wake up with some kind of superconsciousness to know that the ordinary consciousness the rest of us mortals have is just an illusion. In other words, he'd have to be someone like God in order to know that. If this is your first time here, make sure and hit that subscribe button so that you never miss a video or an interview, and please make sure to click the bell as well. Our goal is to help you enter into a confirmed, confident, and eternal relationship with the source of all life and purpose. So we're going to look at 5 different quotes or series of quotes from some notable atheists or non-believers in Christianity. And we're going to start off with somebody who's a bit of an agnostic, actually, named Robert Jastrow. Dr. Robert Jastrow, who until his death was the director of the Mount Wilson Observatory, once led by Edwin Hubble. Dr. Jastrow wrote a book called God and the Astronomers. Now, despite revealing, I believe in the first line of chapter 1, that he is personally agnostic about many religious matters, he writes this: "Now we see how the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. The details differ, but the essential elements in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis are the same. The chain of events leading to man commenced suddenly and sharply at a definite moment in time in a flash of light and energy." Additionally, in an interview, Jastrow went even further, admitting that astronomers now find they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in this cosmos and on the earth. And they have found that all this happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. That there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. Now, hearing this some years ago, my first thought was, wow, like you said it better than I could ever say it. Yet you don't believe in God. You deviate from the evidence once it comes to arriving at the conclusion of that evidence. So could it be that this is not a head issue, but a heart issue? In fact, the editor's note from the Robert Jastrow interview in Christianity Today some years ago says the Robert Jastrow interview represents a rather unusual article for Christianity Today. Jastrow makes no pretense of being Christian, nor does he even profess to be a theist. But I believe he represents in sharp relief a startling phenomenon of our time. Modern science, which first gained life and nourishment within a Christian and indeed an evangelical world and life view, now largely operates from a framework of practical atheism. But some contemporary scientists are left with an uneasy scientific conscience. So the editor notes that modern science, which first gained life and nourishment within a Christian and indeed evangelical world and life view, has deviated to ignore that foundation. It's correct. Modern science is well rooted in Christianity. In fact, here are only a few of the scores of scientists that not only led in their fields, but in many cases actually created their field of study. And they did so by their own admission because they believed in God and therefore believed that since he ordered the universe, that they could in turn study that order. So let's look at a few. First, Bernard Riemann. He was the son of a Lutheran pastor. He was a devout Christian who died reciting the Lord's Prayer, it's recorded. He saw life as a mathematician as another way to serve God. Wow. He transformed geometry, providing the foundation of Einstein's theory of general relativity, and the Riemann hypothesis has become the most famous unresolved problem in mathematics. Second, let's look at George Washington Carver. He was a Protestant evangelist and Bible class leader whose faith in Jesus was the mechanism through which he carried out his scientific work. He would make the time to attend church and every morning go for a walk in the woods to communicate with the Creator. He ended up improving the agricultural economy of the U.S. by promoting nitrogen, providing peanuts as an alternative crop to cotton to prevent soil depletion. Next, Charles Babbage. He was a Protestant devotee who devoted a chapter of his autobiography to a discussion of his faith. He's the father of the computer. He invented the analytical engine, which is a Turing computer first brought to bear in 1837, which is the first general purpose computer. Let's talk about Antoine Lavoisier, Roman Catholic believer in the authenticity of the Holy Scriptures. He's the founder of modern chemistry. He discovered oxygen's role in combustion and respiration, and he discovered that water is a compound of hydrogen and oxygen. His Traité élémentaire de chimie is considered the first modern chemistry book. Finally, let's talk about Sir Isaac Newton. I think we've all heard of him. He's known as the father of modern physics. He delineated 3 important laws of motion, as well as did a lot of other works with optics and theology. You know, an interesting story about Isaac Newton is that while he was at Trinity College in Cambridge, England, he was forced to return home due to the Great Plague of London. Now, during his time of quarantine, which he later referred to as the Annus Mirabilis, the Year of Wonders, Newton invented calculus, developed theories on optics, and defined the theory of gravity. Wow. So I hope everyone out there was just as productive with their time, your time of quarantine as well. Newton's work on the gravitational force and other calculations on water are also interesting, as are his views on God. Now, Newton said, "And from true lordship it follows that the true God is living, intelligent, and powerful from the other perfections, that he is supreme or supremely perfect. He is eternal and infinite, omnipotent and omniscient. That is, he endures from eternity to eternity, and he is present from infinity to infinity. He rules all things, and he knows all things that happen or can happen." And this is not from some work he wrote on religion. In fact, this is actually an excerpt from his Principia Mathematica, which is arguably the most important scientific treatise ever penned. Now, being a scientist and being Christian doesn't necessarily prove Christianity is true, but it is important to note that these men were Christians and they believed that they were able to do science because there was a God who made that possible. Now, for the next one, we're going to examine several quotes from this gentleman, and his name is Sir Fred Hoyle. He was an English astronomer who formulated the theory of stellar nucleosynthesis. I don't even know what that is. So he's a really smart guy. He said this: "I do not believe that any scientist who examined the evidence would fail to draw the inference that the laws of nuclear physics have been deliberately designed with regard to the consequences they produce inside the stars." He says a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. But then he also says, "I am not a Christian, nor am I likely to become one as far as I can tell." Interesting. So he sees that the intricacy of the universe, and he would know, looks like it was deliberately designed, and that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics because, based on the evidence that he sees in his field of study, that's what makes the most sense, even though in the end he denies that conclusion. James Tour, who himself is a nanoscientist, says only a rookie who knows nothing about science would say that science takes away from faith. If you really study science, it will bring you closer to God. One reason why is because there are more than 122 precise constants in nature and in the universe that need to be in place and operating properly in order for anything to exist or to be, not to mention the precision necessary in order for life to be able to be sustained on Earth. A mathematical publication says, changing these constants changes how the universe hangs together, which forces are most important, what chemical elements are possible, how and if things interact, whether or not stars exist or for how long. What's really spooky is that even tiny changes in most of the physical constants tend to make life and even the universe as we know it impossible. Further, the fundamental constants of physics remain unchanged over the past 93.5% to now 99.9973% of cosmic history. And so listen, the book of nature is amazing, but some have been so enamored with the amazing sights, sounds, and qualities in nature that they have missed the forest for the trees. No pun intended. John Lennox, who himself is a scientist and mathematician in Oxford, says this: "The success of science sometimes leads people to think that because we can understand the mechanisms of the universe, then we can safely conclude that there was no God who designed and created the universe in the first place. This reasoning commits a logical error in that it confuses mechanism and agency. In other words, there had to be a doer to do what got done. The next quote I want to look at is from a well-known atheist named Richard Dawkins, and this is actually more of a conversation than one isolated quote. Now, much of what he has said has been quoted and discussed, so here I would just like to look at one conversation that he had. And actually, it's recorded in this book by Frank Turek, Stealing from God. It says, Dawkins admitted this in an interview with radio host Justin Brierley. Let's listen in after Dawkins maintained that our sense of morality is an outcome of the evolutionary process. Brierley: when you make a value judgment, don't you immediately step yourself outside of this evolutionary process and say that the reason that this is good is that it's good? And you don't have any way to stand on that judgment. Dawkins responds, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. Brierley: so therefore it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. Dawkins: you could say that. Nothing about it makes it more probable that there is anything supernatural. Brierley: ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact that we've evolved 5 fingers instead of 6. Dawkins: you could say that, yeah. Now, in another place, Turek writes, the moral implications of atheism are unlivable. Dawkins actually recognizes this when he categorically rejects Darwinian survival of the fittest ethics, calling the Darwinian morality ruthless. Dr. Dawkins told radio host Michael Medved, I've always said that I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to the way we should organize our lives and our morality. He said, we want to avoid basing our society on Darwinian principles. So despite claiming that we just dance to our DNA, Dawkins introduces a moral code by saying we should not follow our DNA. Consistency is not his strong point. So as far as moral reasoning is concerned, the proud atheist Richard Dawkins readily admits that his worldview is unlivable and therefore unreasonable in bringing with it a suitable moral standard. There's a more fundamental problem as well. Even Charles Darwin himself noticed it. Let me explain. Why should one suppose that his or her brain, which blindly originates from more simple species and originally from energy, is a trustworthy source for even engaging in epistemological endeavors? So Charles Darwin, who may be considered the father of macroevolutionary theory, once wrote, but then with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? Gardner notes, Darwin used and trusted his mind in developing his theory of evolution. But when his mind suggested the idea of a creator, he suddenly could not trust his mind. This brings to light one glaring issue for naturalism and specifically for naturalistic philosophers. The question is not, does naturalism provide valid answers, but can such a worldview even justify asking the questions? Alvin Plantinga said that in philosophy, knowledge is warranted true belief, and a belief has warrant for some person if and only if that belief was formed by cognitive faculties that are functioning properly and in accordance with a good design plan in a cognitive environment appropriate for the way those faculties were designed and when the design plan for our faculties is aimed at obtaining truth. The question then arises, does naturalism profess a good design plan where cognitive faculties can grow? Moreland responds, now the notion of proper function understood as functioning the way something ought to function makes clear sense of artifacts that are designed by an intelligence. Why? Because the claim that something functions the way it ought to is easily understood in terms of functioning the way it was designed to function. The naturalist owes us an account of what it would mean for humans to have properly functioning cognitive and sensory faculties that can avoid the idea of a designer, and, says Plantinga, those accounts have not been successful. We also need to note that even if logic and reason could be ontologically sustained, in other words, not just how we know the rules of logic, but what logic and reasoning actually are, if they could be sustained in a naturalistic or atheistic framework, it still would not be certain that we could trust whatever logic or reasoning capacity were to emerge from that system. Next, let's look at Antony Flew, once the most prominent atheistic philosopher probably of the entire 20th century, who routinely used to debate theists and Christians. He said this, for if Christian apologists are to produce good evidencing reasons for believing that they have a hold on an authentic revelation, then they have to presuppose the existence of a strong natural order, an order the maintenance of which is physically necessary and which it is humanly impossible to violate. If truly there is no such order, then there can be no question of any overridings of it, and hence no question of referring to any alleged overridings in order to validate anything. So here, Flew is addressing the idea of miracles. And so I would say, well, you have to presuppose it too. Christians have no problem presupposing such an order. Atheists should, though. He says, an order, the maintenance of which is physically necessary and which it is humanly impossible to violate. Exactly. That's the claim of fine-tuning. No problem here in Christianity. He says, if truly there is no such order, then there can be no question of any overridings of it, and hence no question of referring to any alleged overridings in order to validate anything. Okay, but there is such an order, and it is agreed upon throughout all of science. And this makes it possible to notice when that order has been temporarily interrupted or intruded by way of a miracle. The order actually allows us to recognize the miracle, which is a deviation temporarily from that order. And I now must call him former atheist Anthony Flew, because Flew openly made an allegiance prior to his demise to deism, not knowing if he went all the way to Christianity prior to his death. And the reason that he stated was that in keeping his lifelong commitment to go where the evidence leads, he now believed in the existence of God. Why? He said, what I think the DNA material has done is that it has shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together. Elsewhere, I've detailed how DNA speaks to the reality of a designer, but here I'll simply say I respect Flew's willingness to follow the evidence where it leads, even if it leads somewhere that's not comfortable. And finally, let's look at David Hume, himself another great atheistic philosopher of centuries past. Hume writes, the Christian religion not only was at first attended with miracles, but even at this day cannot be believed by any reasonable person without one. Mere reason is insufficient to convince us of its veracity. And whoever is moved by faith to assent to it is conscious of a continued miracle in his own person, which subverts all the principles of his understanding and gives him a determination to believe what is most contrary to custom and experience. At first glance, it may seem odd as to why I pulled this quote. Now, even though Hume doesn't believe in miracles, he does seem to affirm that there is a miracle at the center of Christianity, which is true. So very quickly, I want to point out to any extremely progressive or unorthodox Christians or people who call themselves Christians, the resurrection account of Jesus Christ is in regards to a literal bodily resurrection. A spiritual resurrection makes no sense of the evidence, including why would a group of liars protect the ultimate liar, which is what Jesus would have been if he didn't rise from the grave, in order to start a fake religion for which they gained nothing, lost everything, including their lives. Now, Hume said mere reason is insufficient. I also kind of agree with that. It's not that we don't have any reasons to believe the resurrection. In fact, all of the evidence points towards that being the best explanation for the empty tomb. And I've done other videos comparing the resurrection hypothesis to all of the naturalistic hypotheses for why the tomb was found empty. A fact, by the way, which is agreed upon by 75% of scholars. Hume goes on to say, and whoever is moved by faith to assent to it is conscious of a continued miracle in his own person. I've never thought about how God moves a person and holds them in their belief in him throughout his or her life as a miracle, but, it's kind of cool. Now, I don't think we need to think of it as a miracle, but whether we do or don't, God is still the one who's doing the work. Hume says, gives him a determination to believe what is most contrary to custom and experience. That's kind of the point. Salvation is not like anything else. It is contrary to custom and experience. That's actually one of the ways that it's noticeable. Also, as I've stated before, if this was a common experience or if miracles were common, then they wouldn't be miracles. Miracles are by definition rare occurrences. Mere reason is insufficient to convince us of its veracity, and whoever is moved by faith to assent to it is conscious of a continued miracle in his own person. Well, if mere reason is insufficient, then how can that person be conscious of a continued miracle within themselves if the claim is that in this instance, reason has failed the individual? Lastly, the Christian worldview doesn't rest upon a mere belief in a supposed miracle, but in a historically verifiable event. Christianity provides a testable faith. Christianity presents a set of facts and propositions to be true, and it's completely comfortable with anyone testing those claims. But I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments of some things you've heard people say that are interesting or puzzling as far as reasons why they don't believe in God or why they don't believe Christianity is true. Please let me know in the comments, and I'll try to interact with as many as possible. Until next time, peace.